The dust on Ostrava never really settled. It hung in the orange evening light like tiny flakes of rust, drifting past the broken fence at the edge of the colony. Daniel Hale sat alone on an old crate near that fence, watching the dust move, because watching dust was easier than watching people. People on Ostrava did not look at him kindly. He was small for his age, with thin arms and a cough that never fully went away, and the other children, human and alien alike, had long ago decided he was not worth their time. Ostrava was not a proud place. It was a leftover colony tucked into a quiet corner of space that the great alien powers barely remembered existed. Humans lived here because there was nowhere better to go. Centuries ago, something had happened to old Earth, something the grown-ups called the Silence, and after that humanity had been scattered, forgotten, and treated like a minor species by nearly everyone else in the galaxy. The Congress of Starlit Worlds, the alliance that ruled most of known space, tolerated humans the way one tolerates a stray animal. Not cruelly most of the time, just without respect. Daniel did not think about the Congress much. He thought about his grandmother's stories, the ones she told at night when the colony lights dimmed and the twin moons rose over the scrapfields. Ruth Hale was old, older than anyone else in the settlement, with hands that shook slightly but eyes that missed nothing. She had once worked as an engineer for something called the Old Earth Defense Corps, though nobody quite believed that anymore. She kept a small metal ring in a locked drawer, and sometimes, when she thought Daniel was asleep, she would take it out and simply hold it, staring at nothing. "Not yet," she would whisper, "not yet, but soon." Daniel had asked her once what the ring was for. She had only patted his head and said some things were better explained when he was older. He did not push. Pushing never worked with Grandmother Hale. Tonight, though, something felt different. Daniel could not explain why. Maybe it was the strange dream he'd had again, the one with fire and scales and a low voice, deeper than thunder, calling him something that was not his name. "Last Warden," the voice always said. He never understood it, and it always scared him a little, though not in the way nightmares usually scared him. This felt more like a memory that was not his own. He was still thinking about the dream when he heard it. A sound, low and rolling, like something enormous falling from a great height. It came from beyond the fence, out past the scrap fields where old machine parts rusted under the open sky. The ground trembled slightly under his feet. Dust rose in a heavy cloud on the horizon. Daniel stood up. Every instinct told him to run back toward the colony and tell an adult. But his feet did not move that way. Instead, almost as if something were pulling him, he climbed through the broken section of fence and walked toward the smoke rising in the distance. The scrapfield was a graveyard of old machines, twisted metal, and broken hover crates left behind by decades of careless colonists. Daniel picked his way through the wreckage carefully, his heart hammering, his breath short. The smoke grew thicker, and then he saw it. At first he thought it was a downed shuttle, some kind of alien craft that had crashed. But as he crept closer, he realized it was not metal at all. It was alive. A massive shape lay curled among the broken machines, its body covered in dark, overlapping scales that shimmered faintly even in the dim light. Smoke rose from a wound along its side. Its breathing was slow and ragged, each breath shaking the ground beneath it. Daniel froze. Every part of him screamed to run. This was not a colonist's animal or a farm creature. This was something out of the old stories, something enormous and ancient and clearly, painfully injured. He should have turned back right then. Any sensible person would have. But then the creature's eye opened. It was large, golden, and impossibly old-looking, like it held centuries behind it, and it looked directly at Daniel. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Daniel expected fire or a roar or some terrible attack. Instead, the creature simply watched him, its breathing slowing slightly, as if it was surprised that the small human boy had not yet run away screaming. "Please," Daniel whispered, though he had no idea why he said it or who he was speaking to. "Please don't hurt me." The creature made a low sound, almost like a groan, and its great head lowered slightly toward the ground. It did not attack. It did not even try to move closer. It simply lay there, wounded and exhausted, watching the boy with those ancient golden eyes. Daniel's legs were shaking, But something in him, something he could not name, told him this creature was not his enemy. He thought of his grandmother's ring, locked away in its drawer. He thought of the voice from his dreams, last warden. He took one careful step closer. Behind him, faint and distant, the colony's alarm systems had begun to stir, sensors detecting the unknown energy signature that had crashed into the scrapfield. Soon, security patrols would come. Soon, everyone would know something enormous had landed on Ostrava. But for now, in the quiet dust and smoke, it was only Daniel and the wounded creature, and the strange, growing feeling that his ordinary, overlooked life was about to change forever. Rain had never once fallen on Ostrava in Daniel's lifetime, but that night, the sky rumbled anyway, dry thunder rolling over the colony like a warning nobody could translate. Daniel did not hear it. He was too busy trying to keep a dying stranger alive. He had not told anyone about the creature at first. He knew that if he ran back and shouted about a monster in the scrapfield, security patrols would come with weapons, not bandages. So instead, working mostly by moonlight, Daniel had begun sneaking out old medical supplies from the colony's storage shed, things meant for injured farm animals, and bringing them to the wounded shape hidden among the broken machines. The creature did not attack him. In 3 nights of careful visits, it had done nothing but watch him with those ancient golden eyes, occasionally letting out a low, pained groan when Daniel pressed a cooling patch against the wound along its side. Up close, Daniel realized the scales were not simply scales. They shimmered faintly with something like circuitry beneath the surface, threads of pale light running under the dark plating. This was not just an animal. This was something built, or grown, or both. "You're not going to eat me, are you?" Daniel asked one night, trying to sound braver than he felt. The creature's throat rumbled, a sound that was almost, impossibly, like quiet laughter. "If I wanted to eat you," it said, in a voice that was low and rough, like stones grinding slowly together, "I would not have needed 3 nights to decide." Daniel nearly dropped the medical kit in his hands. "You can talk." "You can talk as well," the creature replied dryly. "It is not so remarkable." Daniel sat back on his heels, staring. Up close, in the moonlight, he could see just how massive the creature truly was, easily 3 times the length of the biggest hover truck in the colony, with wings folded tightly against its body and claws longer than Daniel's whole arm. And yet, it had let a 12-year-old boy tend its wounds without protest. "What are you?" Daniel finally asked. The creature was silent for a long moment. "My name is Kayleys," it said at last. "Once my kind were called wardens, now mostly we are called extinct. I am the last." "Wardens of what?" Kayleys's golden eyes studied him carefully, as if weighing how much truth the boy could hold. "Of balance," he said. "Long ago, before your Congress of Starlit Worlds ruled the stars, there were terrible wars between many peoples. My kind were made, bred and built both, to end those wars by force so great that no side dared fight while a warden watched. We were weapons, boy, weapons with minds." Daniel swallowed. "And you're hiding because—" "Because those who rule the galaxy now fear that history might repeat itself," Kayleys said. "They fear my kind returning to power, so they hunted us, quietly, over centuries, until only I remained. I have hidden longer than your colony has existed." It should have terrified Daniel more than it did. Instead, he found himself thinking of his grandmother's stories, her careful silences, the small metal ring she guarded so closely. "My grandmother has a ring," he said slowly. "She always says it's not time yet. She gets this look when she talks about old Earth, like she knows things nobody else does." For the first time, Kayleys went very still. "Describe this ring." Daniel did his best, remembering its shape. The faint markings etched into the metal, the way it seemed to catch light strangely. As he spoke, Kayleys's great body tensed, and a low hum began to rise from deep within his chest, almost like a machine powering on. "Bring it to me," Kayleys said quietly. "Tomorrow night. Bring the ring and bring your grandmother if she will come." Daniel did not sleep well that night. When morning came, he found himself standing outside his grandmother's small room, working up the courage to ask about a secret she had kept locked away for years. When he finally told her everything, about the creature, about Kayleys, about the ring, he expected her to be angry or frightened or to forbid him from ever going near the scrapfield again. Instead, Ruth Hale went very pale, sat down slowly in her chair, and was silent for a long time. "I always knew this day might come," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "I just hoped it would come when you were older, stronger." "Grandma, what is this ring? What does it do?" She reached into the locked drawer, taking out the small metal band, turning it over in her shaking hands. "This was passed down in our family for 6 generations," she said. "Since before the silence took old Earth from the stars. It is not decoration, Daniel. It is a key. Our family were called Warden's Kin once, chosen long ago to bond with creatures like the one you found. It was a partnership, not ownership. A promise between two kinds, made in the oldest wars this galaxy ever knew." Daniel stared at the ring, at his grandmother's tired, worried eyes. "Why did nobody ever tell me?" "Because that history was erased," she said softly, "by people far more powerful than us, who did not want humanity remembering what we once were." She pressed the ring gently into his palm, closing his fingers around it. "Tonight, we go together. It's time you learn the truth, whatever it costs us." Outside, unnoticed by either of them, the colony's outer sensors had finally detected the strange biological signature buried in the scrapfield. Security patrols were already being organized, weapons checked, orders given. By the time night fell and Daniel and his grandmother made their way back toward the wreckage where Kaylee's waited, they would not be alone for long. The scrapfield had never seen so many lights at once. Hover lanterns bobbed through the darkness, security patrol beams sweeping across broken machinery, voices shouting orders back and forth. Word had spread fast once the colony's sensors confirmed something enormous and unregistered was hiding among the wreckage. By the time Daniel and his grandmother arrived, a full patrol of armed colonial guards had already surrounded the area where Kaylee's lay hidden. Daniel's heart pounded as he pushed through the crowd gathering at the edge of the fence. Administrator Voss stood near the front of the security line, arms crossed, his expression somewhere between annoyance and alarm. Voss was the kind of official who liked simple problems with simple solutions, and an ancient alien creature hiding in his colony was neither simple nor solvable in the way he preferred. "Get that boy back," Voss snapped, noticing Daniel trying to slip past the barrier. "This is not a place for children." "You don't understand," Daniel said, his voice shaking but firm. "He's hurt. He's not dangerous, he's just hurt. It's a live weapon-class biological boy, according to our scanners," Voss said sharply. "It has already been marked for neutralization." Neutralization. Daniel's stomach twisted at the word. Behind him, Ruth Hale stepped forward, her cane tapping firmly against the ground, her voice carrying more authority than her small frame suggested. "Administrator Voss," she said, "before your people do something they cannot undo, I would strongly suggest you listen to what my grandson and I have to say." Voss frowned, clearly unused to being addressed so boldly by an elderly colonist. Still, something about Ruth's steady gaze made him hesitate. "You have 1 minute, Mrs. Hale." There was no time to explain everything properly. Ruth simply held up the small metal ring, letting it catch the harsh light of the security lanterns. "This," she said, "is proof that what your scanners detected is not simply a monster to be destroyed. It is the last of an ancient species once bonded to protect, not destroy, and my family has carried the means to prove that bond for 6 generations." Voss stared at the ring, clearly unconvinced. "With respect, that's a story, not evidence." Before Ruth could argue further, the ground trembled. A low, rolling growl rose from within the wreckage, and every guard's weapon snapped up in response. Kaylee's was rising, slowly, painfully, his massive form emerging from the shadows of broken machinery, wings unfolding just enough to reveal his true size. Gasps and shouts rippled through the gathered crowd. Even the trained security guards took an instinctive step back. "Hold your fire," Voss shouted, though his voice cracked slightly with fear. Daniel did not think. He simply moved, slipping past the barrier before anyone could stop him, running toward Kaylee's and placing himself directly between the wounded creature and the line of raised weapons. "Daniel," Ruth cried out, but it was too late to pull him back. "Don't shoot him," Daniel shouted, his small frame trembling but standing firm. He hasn't hurt anyone. He's just scared and hurt, just like anyone would be." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Guards kept their weapons raised, uncertain whether to fire past the boy or hold their position. Kayles, despite his pain, lowered his great head slightly, positioning himself so that his body shielded Daniel rather than the other way around. "Enough," Ruth said, striding forward with a determination that silenced even Voss's protests. She reached Daniel's side and pressed the small ring firmly into his palm. "It's time, Daniel. Whatever happens next, you need to know the truth of who you are." The moment Daniel's fingers closed fully around the ring, something changed. A faint golden light began to pulse from the metal, warm against his skin, spreading up his arm in delicate lines that glowed briefly beneath the surface, like the light Daniel had seen beneath Kayles' scales. The dragon's eyes widened, his breathing catching sharply. "That signature," Kayles rumbled, his voice filled with disbelief. "It cannot be, after all these centuries." The golden light intensified, resonating between the ring and the faint markings across Kayles' scales, until the entire scrapfield seemed bathed in a soft, impossible glow. Every guard, every onlooker, even Administrator Voss himself, stood frozen, staring at the sight unfolding before them. Kayles' great head lowered further, his enormous body bending in a way that seemed almost impossible for a creature his size, until his snout nearly touched the dusty ground before Daniel. It was, unmistakably, unquestionably, a bow. "Warden's kin," Kayles said softly, his rough voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "Last of the old bloodline, I had thought your line lost forever." Daniel stood frozen, the ring still glowing faintly in his hand, utterly unsure of what was happening, but somehow understanding, deep down, that his life had just changed in a way he could never take back. Around him, guards slowly lowered their weapons, too stunned to remember their orders. Administrator Voss stared, his mouth slightly open, his simple solutions clearly no longer sufficient for the situation before him. Somewhere in the crowd, someone had their communicator raised, recording everything. Within minutes, the footage would spread beyond Ostrava, beyond the colony's small corner of space, racing across communication networks toward the wider galaxy. A creature the Congress of Starlit Worlds believed extinct had just bowed, publicly and unmistakably, to a human boy. The galaxy was about to learn a secret that had been buried for a very long time. 3 days after the bow, Ostrava had more starships in its skis than it had seen in the last 30 years combined. Sleek Congress cruisers hung in orbit, their hulls marked with the symbols of species Daniel had only ever seen in old educational broadcasts. The colony's small landing field, usually reserved for supply shuttles, now hosted a delegation shuttle far grander than anything Ostrava's people had ever built. Daniel watched it all from the window of his grandmother's house, feeling like the world had tilted sideways and never quite settled back into place. Since the night in the scrapfield, everything had changed. Kayles, though still recovering, had been permitted to remain near the colony, mostly because nobody, not even the arriving Congress officials, seemed quite brave enough to try moving him by force. Guards now stood outside the Hale household not to threaten them, but awkwardly to protect them, though from what exactly, nobody had yet explained. "They're here for you," Ruth said quietly, standing beside him at the window. "Both of you." The delegation was led by an alien named Overseer Thessaly, a tall, elegant being with silver-blue skin and an expression that made it clear she considered the entire situation a great inconvenience. She arrived at the Hale household escorted by Administrator Voss, who looked distinctly smaller and more nervous than he had just days earlier. "Mrs. Hale, young Daniel," Thessaly said, her tone polite but cold, the kind of politeness that barely hid impatience underneath. "I trust you understand the seriousness of what has occurred." "I understand a lot of guards nearly shot an injured creature who never hurt anyone," Daniel said before he could stop himself. Thessaly's expression flickered with mild surprise, though she recovered quickly. "The being you call Kayles is classified as an extreme threat by every record the Congress possesses. Draconi wardens were weapons capable of ending entire fleets single-handedly. That such a creature would bow to anyone, let alone a human child, is deeply troubling. Troubling because it's dangerous, Ruth said evenly, or troubling because it means our history isn't what your Congress has told everyone for centuries. The room went quiet. Thessaly's composed expression tightened slightly. You are treading dangerous ground, Mrs. Hale. It was Kaylee's, resting just outside the house under careful watch, who finally broke the tension, his deep voice rumbling clearly even through the walls. Perhaps, he said, it would be more efficient if I simply explained myself rather than allowing assumptions to multiply. Thessaly stiffened, but did not object as everyone moved outside to where Kaylee's lay, still healing but far more alert than he had been days before. Guards shifted uneasily at his presence, though none dared raise a weapon with Daniel standing so close beside him. Long before your Congress existed, Kaylee's began, there were wars that nearly tore this part of the galaxy apart. My kind, the Draconi, were created during that time, grown and built to serve as living deterrents. But such power required control, a balance to prevent us from becoming tyrants ourselves. That balance was the Warden Compact, a bond between each Warden and a chosen human partner, someone whose judgment and character would guide our strength. Human partner, Voss repeated, clearly startled. Old Earth was not the primitive world your records suggest, Kaylee's continued. Humanity once stood as trusted guardians of my kind, respected across many worlds. That changed when certain early Congress powers grew fearful of that alliance, seeing it as a threat to their own dominance. They orchestrated humanity's downfall, scattered your people, erased the history, and quietly hunted my kind to near extinction, all while presenting themselves as protectors of galactic peace. Thessaly's expression had grown distinctly uncomfortable. That is an extraordinary claim without extraordinary evidence. The evidence, Kaylee said, lowering his great head slightly toward Daniel, stood before your very eyes 3 nights ago. The bond cannot be faked, Overseer. It recognizes bloodline, character, and intent, not politics. I bowed because the boy's presence and the ring his family protected for generations proved beyond doubt that the old compact still lives, however unlikely that may seem to you. Daniel, still trying to process being called part of something so enormous, glanced at his grandmother, who gave him a small, tired, but proud smile. Voss cleared his throat, some of his earlier nervousness returning. Regardless of history, Overseer, we now have a live situation. A creature capable of ending fleets is bonded to a 12-year-old boy on my colony. Surely that concerns everyone here. It concerns me a great deal, Thessaly said sharply, some of her composure slipping. The Congress cannot simply allow an uncontrolled weapon-class being and an untrained child to remain unsupervised. Protocol demands containment for the safety of the wider galaxy. Kaylee's low growl rumbled through the air, a warning more than a threat. Containment, he repeated. That word again, always containment, never partnership. Thessaly straightened, clearly done with diplomacy for the moment. Regardless of your objections, Warden, the Congress will not simply take your word or an old family ring as sufficient proof of anything. I will be recommending immediate protective custody of both the boy and yourself, pending full investigation. Daniel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. You can't just take us. I can, Thessaly said quietly, though not unkindly, and unless you can prove otherwise, I likely will. You have until tomorrow morning to reconsider cooperating peacefully. She turned sharply and walked back toward her shuttle, Voss hurrying nervously after her, leaving Daniel, Ruth, and Kaylee standing together in the fading evening light, the weight of an entire galaxy's fear and history now resting heavily on their small colony. By midnight, the sky above Ostrava had changed completely. What had been a handful of Congress ships now looked more like a small fleet, their running lights forming a slow, deliberate ring around the upper atmosphere. Daniel stood outside his grandmother's house, staring up at them, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking about Thessaly's ultimatum. Tomorrow morning felt impossibly close. You should rest, Ruth said, stepping out to join him, wrapping a thin blanket around his shoulders despite the mild night air. Tomorrow will need all the strength you have. How can I rest? Daniel asked. They want to take Kaylee's away, maybe me too, and I don't even understand what I'm supposed to do about any of it. Ruth was quiet for a moment, looking up at the alien ships circling above like slow, watchful predators. "Your great-great-grandfather once told me something," she finally said. "He said the old wardens were never meant to be controlled through fear or force. They were meant to be guided through trust, patience, and calm judgment. That's what the bond truly is, Daniel, not command, partnership." Behind them, Kaylee stirred, having listened silently to their conversation. "Your grandmother speaks truly," he said. "The compact is not a leash, boy. It is a promise freely given. If you wish to face what's coming tomorrow, you must understand that first." Daniel turned to face him, still uncertain. "What if I make a mistake? What if I panic and something goes wrong?" "Then we learn," Kaylee said simply. "Together, that is what partnership means." The following morning arrived far too quickly. By the time the sun rose fully over Ostrava, Thessaly's shuttle had already landed once more, this time accompanied by armored escort ships and a full unit of Congress enforcers. Word had spread through the colony overnight, and a nervous crowd had gathered at a careful distance, watching as Overseer Thessaly approached the Hale household with a grim, formal expression. "I had hoped you would reconsider peacefully," Thessaly said, addressing Ruth and Daniel directly. "Instead, my superiors have authorized full containment procedures, effective immediately." Behind her, enforcer units began moving forward, restraint devices and specialized containment equipment in hand, clearly designed for something the size of Kaylee's. The crowd tensed. Guards from Ostrava's own security force hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or step aside. Kaylee's rose to his full height for the first time since his injury, and though he was still healing, his presence alone was enough to make the approaching enforcers pause. "I would advise against this course of action," he rumbled. "This is not a negotiation," Thessaly said firmly, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her voice now. Daniel stepped forward before he could stop himself, positioning himself once again between Kaylee's and the approaching enforcers, just as he had days earlier. His heart pounded, but his voice, when he spoke, was steadier than he expected. "Kaylee's," he said clearly, "stand down, no fighting, not today." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, deliberately, Kaylee's lowered his stance, folding his wings back against his body, his posture shifting from defensive to calm. The enforcers, who had clearly expected violence, hesitated in obvious confusion. "You see," Daniel said, turning toward Thessaly, his voice trembling slightly but not breaking. "This is what the bond means, not a weapon waiting to explode. A partner who listens, even when he's scared, even when everyone around him expects him to fight." Thessaly stared, clearly unsettled by the display. Around the crowd, murmurs rippled outward. Colonists, and even some of her own enforcers, visibly moved by what they had just witnessed. "A single demonstration proves little," Thessaly said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Then let it prove more," Kaylee said. Slowly, deliberately, he allowed his disguising systems, the ones that had kept his full nature hidden for centuries, to fall away completely. His true form emerged fully in the morning light, vast and ancient, scales shimmering with countless threads of pale golden light beneath the surface, wings spreading wide enough to cast a shadow over half the crowd. Gasps rippled through onlookers, but this time no one raised a weapon. "I do not reveal myself for conquest," Kaylee said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence. "I reveal myself to show you what true partnership looks like, restrained not by chains, but by trust freely given." Almost as if in response, something strange began happening across the crowd's communicators. Reports started coming in from other scattered human colonies, distant and disconnected, of individuals experiencing sudden, inexplicable reactions, faint golden markings appearing briefly on their skin, old family heirlooms glowing faintly for the first time in generations. The broadcast of Kaylee's revelation, spreading rapidly across colonial networks, seemed to be waking something dormant across humanity itself. Thessaly's enforcers shifted uneasily, their equipment suddenly detecting the same growing energy signature, not just localized to Ostrava, but rippling faintly across dozens of systems. "This is not possible," Thessaly murmured, staring at the readings on her own device. "It is exactly as it should be," Kaylee said calmly. "The compact was never truly destroyed, Overseer, merely dormant, waiting, and now it remembers itself." With a final, decisive motion, Kaylee's raised one massive claw, not toward the enforcers, but toward their weapons and equipment, releasing a soft pulse of golden energy that swept harmlessly, but unmistakably, over their gear. Every weapon in the enforcers' hands powered down instantly, their systems neutralized without a single act of violence. "I could have done far worse," Kaylee said quietly. "I chose not to. Remember that when you report back to your Congress." Thessaly stood frozen, staring at her disabled forces, at the glowing colony, at the boy standing calmly beside an ancient, impossibly powerful being who had chosen restraint over destruction. For the first time since her arrival, she had absolutely no idea what to say. Weeks passed before Ostrava's skis finally cleared of Congress warships, though what remained afterward was very different from what had first arrived. Instead of enforcers and containment vessels, diplomatic shuttles now came and went with careful regularity, their delegations far more polite, far more curious, and noticeably more respectful than before. Daniel sat on the same old crate near the fence where this had all begun, though the fence itself had since been repaired, and the scrapfield beyond it cleared of debris. Kaylee's rested nearby, no longer hiding his true form, his presence now a familiar, comforting sight to the colonists who had once feared him. Children who used to ignore Daniel now waved at him as they passed, some even asking shy questions about what it was like having a dragon for a friend. Daniel still wasn't entirely used to the attention, but it no longer felt as strange as it once had. "You're quiet today," Kaylee's observed, his golden eyes half closed in the warm afternoon light. "Just thinking," Daniel said, "about everything that's happened. It still doesn't feel real sometimes." "It rarely does at first," Kaylee said. "Great change is like that. It settles slowly, long after the moment itself has passed." The Congress's official investigation had, in the end, confirmed everything Kaylee's and Ruth had claimed. Old records, long suppressed and carefully hidden, were rediscovered, verifying humanity's forgotten role as founding guardians alongside the Draconi Wardens. Overseer Thessaly, though still visibly uncomfortable with the entire situation, had been forced to formally acknowledge the reawakened Warden Compact in a full Congress session, a moment broadcast across countless worlds. Administrator Voss, once dismissive of Daniel and humanity's standing among the stars, had become, somewhat awkwardly, one of the loudest voices advocating for humanity's renewed respect within the wider galaxy, eager to align himself with the sudden change in fortune. Not everyone had been pleased. Some Congress factions still viewed the reawakening with deep suspicion, fearing what it might mean for the delicate balance of power they had maintained for centuries. But with each passing week, more reports arrived of other Wardenblood humans awakening across scattered colonies, their family heirlooms activating just as Daniel's ring had proof that the old bond was not an isolated event, but something far larger stirring back to life across human space. Ruth Hale watched it all unfold with a quiet, tired satisfaction. One evening, as the twin moons rose over Ostrava, she sat beside Daniel on the porch, her hands finally still, no longer shaking with the weight of a secret she had carried for so long. "I always wondered if I'd live to see this day," she admitted softly. 6 generations, Daniel, 6 generations of our family kept this secret safe, waiting for the right moment, the right person." "Were you scared?" Daniel asked, "all those years keeping it hidden?" "Terrified," Ruth admitted with a small laugh, "but it was never really about me being brave. It was about protecting the chance for someone like you to be brave when the moment finally came." Daniel leaned against her shoulder, feeling, for the first time in a long while, truly at peace. He hadn't asked for any of this, the dreams, the ring, the enormous responsibility now resting on his young shoulders. But somehow, standing here now, none of it felt like a burden anymore. It felt like belonging. Kaylee's, watching the quiet moment between grandmother and grandson, finally spoke, his voice softer than Daniel had ever heard it. "I spent centuries alone, boy," he said. "Hiding, hunted, believing myself the last of a forgotten age with nothing left to protect. I had forgotten what it felt like to belong to someone, to something larger than mere survival. "You're not alone anymore," Daniel said simply. "No," Kaylees agreed, lowering his great head to rest gently near Daniel's side. "I am not, and neither, I think, is your entire species any longer." In the days that followed, more alien delegations arrived at Ostrava, no longer with weapons or ultimatums, but with genuine curiosity and, increasingly, respect. Species who had once barely acknowledged humanity's existence now sought audiences with the small colony that had reawakened one of the galaxy's oldest and most significant alliances. Ostrava, once an overlooked, forgotten outpost, was quickly becoming known across countless star systems as the place where an ancient legacy had finally returned. Daniel remained, through it all, remarkably unchanged at heart. He still preferred quiet evenings by the fence to grand diplomatic gatherings, still enjoyed simple moments with his grandmother far more than official ceremonies in his honor. Power, he was slowly learning, was never really about grand displays or fearsome reputations. It was about the quiet strength to stand firm when it mattered most, and the wisdom to choose partnership over domination, even when the whole galaxy expected otherwise. One evening, as the sun set over Ostrava in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Daniel sat beside Kaylees at the edge of the repaired fence, watching new ships arrive in the distance, each one carrying fresh questions, fresh possibilities, and the promise of a future neither of them could have imagined just weeks earlier. "What happens now?" Daniel asked quietly. Kaylees' golden eyes reflected the setting sun, ancient and wise, yet filled with something that looked remarkably like hope. "Now," he said, "we simply continue forward together and let the galaxy learn slowly what it truly means when humanity and the old wardens stand side by side once more." Above them, the stars began to appear, scattered and endless, no longer distant and unreachable, but full of quiet promise for whatever adventures still lay ahead.